After the murder of Annie Chapman, the area of Whitechapel had become a place of fear and anger. Many believed that the police were doing a poor job at investigating the murders and coming up with any leads. There was a killer on the loose and plenty of suspects, including Leather Apron, who we have already discussed on the last episode of Bizarre Tales, but there were so many more. The fact that a killer was on the loose clinging to the shadows in the dark streets of Whitechapel played on everyone's mind and created a lot of suspicious people. Take Mrs. Fiddymont, for example, the landlady of the Prince Albert pub. Mrs. Fiddymont claimed that on the very same morning when Annie Chapman had been murdered, she served a very sinister looking man who came into a pub at around 7 AM, and at this time Annie Chapman was indeed dead, that we know for certain, but Mrs. Fiddymont wouldn't have been aware at this point. It was only later that she made the possible connection between the stranger and the murder, especially since the man was splattered in blood. The man ordered a drink before venturing back out into the dark morning. And when the murder of Annie Chapman became public knowledge, Mrs. Fiddymont no doubt made it an interesting story to tell her customers, and it wasn't long before the local newspapers caught wind of the story, and 2 days later the following article was posted on the 10th of September by the Morning Post. And now I'm going to read you that article from the very same newspaper. Another clue which may prove of value was furnished by Mrs. Fiddymont, wife and proprietor of the Prince Albert Public House, better known as a Clean House, at the corner of Brushfield and Stewart Street, half a mile from the scene of the murder. Mrs. Fiddymont states that at 7 o'clock on Saturday morning she was standing in the bar talking with another woman, a friend, in the first compartment. Suddenly there came into the middle compartment a man whose rough appearance frightened her. He had on a brown stiff hat, a dark coat and no waistcoat. He came in with his hat down over his eyes and with his face partly concealed, asked for half a pint of 4 ale. She drew the ale and meanwhile looked at him through the mirror at the back of the bar. As soon as he saw the woman in the other compartment watching him, he turned his back and got the partition between himself and her. The thing that struck Mrs. Fiddymont peculiar was the fact that there was blood spots on the back of the right hand. This, taken in connection with the appearance, caused her uneasiness. She also noticed that his shirt was torn. As soon as he had drunk the ale, which he swallowed at a gulp, he went out. A friend went out also to watch him. Her friend is Mrs. Murray Chapelli, who lives at 28 Stewart Street nearby. Her story corroborates Mrs. Fiddymont's and is more particular. When the man came in, the expression on his eyes caught her attention. His look was so startling and terrifying. It frightened Mrs. Fiddymont so much that she requested her to stay. He wore a light blue check shirt which was torn badly into rags. In fact, on the other shoulder there was a narrow streak of blood under his right ear, parallel with the edge of his shirt. There was also dry blood between the fingers of his hand. When he went out, she slipped out of the other door and watched him as he went towards Bishopgate Street. And that was from the Morning Post, and it was published on Monday the 10th of September 1888. Obviously, no one can say whether this man was indeed Jack the Ripper or not, but it was one of many suspects that popped up during the time of the 5 killings. After the killing of Annie Chapman, even more police patrols were placed around the area of Whitechapel, which may have made it more tricky for Jack to strike again right away. As well as the police, there were also the Mile End Vigilance Committee, which was formed by local businessmen on the 10th of September with hopes of capturing the murderer before he struck again. There was a concern at the time that the police were stretched thin and many believed they were doing a terrible job with the investigations, and so the committee was formed as a solution to the problem. And so the committee helped the police cover more ground and patrol the streets of Whitechapel until dawn, reporting on any suspicious behaviour. But Whitechapel was already overrun with crime and was completely separate to the murders, so it was a very difficult task. The committee also believed that a ransom was necessary in order to catch the killer, but trying to raise this reward proved more difficult than they originally thought. You see, the government simply refused to provide a reward for information or capture of the killer, due to the fact that in the past it simply didn't work out, and the police would simply be overrun with leads provided by people who desperately needed the money. So the refusal to give any reward caused the committee to try and raise their own money, and they did manage to raise £50. But they did struggle to raise more due to the residents of Whitechapel simply refusing to give money because they believed that the government should be offering up a reward and not them. But in spite of these little hiccups, the committee did try its best to capture the killer. However, it would seem that despite the efforts made by the committee and the police, it would not be enough. On the 30th of September 1888, Jack would kill 2 more women on the very same night. And the first victim taken by Jack the Ripper on that night was Elizabeth Stride. Elizabeth Stride's story is a very complicated one due to a lot of false information, possibly given by herself, and she also had a tendency to just up and disappear whenever she felt like it. She was said to be a very polite woman, but she did like a drink, and this could turn her very unpleasant. Elizabeth was born on the 27th of November 1843 in Sweden on a farm run by her parents and spent most of her teenage life working as a servant. At some point she started working as a prostitute, and we know this due to her being registered as one by the police in 1865. On the 21st of April, the very same year, she sadly gave birth to a stillborn baby. Between the months of October and November, she was hospitalised for venereal ulcer and then venereal disease. This was probably the reason she lost her baby, but by the 14th of November she was given the all clear and had left the hospital. By February 1886 she had left her home country and come to live in London, and according to records a few months later she registered herself as unmarried. By March the 7th, 1869, Elizabeth was married to John Thomas Stride and took his last name. In 1869, Elizabeth and her husband purchased their own coffee shop business, which was relocated a few times until it became clear that the business was a failure, and it was taken over by Mr. John Dale in 1874. About 4 years passed, and what we do know is that Elizabeth was staying in a workhouse by 1878. But here is where the story becomes slightly strange. It is believed she may have made up the following story to gather some kind of compensation or sympathy. On the 3rd of September 1878, a British passenger paddle steamer called the SS Alice collided with a cargo ship called the Bywell Castle on the River Thames. The SS Alice basically split into 3 pieces, and within 4 minutes it had sunken into the very heavy polluted waters of the Thames, killing between 600 to 700 passengers. This number is so vague due to the fact that there was no head count taken of the passengers and no passengers list was taken, so in reality the exact number of deaths will never be known. And the many people who survived the wreck would die due to being submerged for so long in the disgusting conditions of that particular stretch of water, which was heavily polluted with raw sewage, and many of the bloated corpses which were found later that had been discovered by boatmen or simply washed up on the shore were said to be covered in thick slimy sewage that had sped up the rotting process of the flesh and also the clothing, making identifying the dead a very hard job. And according to Elizabeth Stride, herself and her husband and children were on board the SS Alice when the disaster happened, and she lost her entire family when the steamer sank below the infested waters. But she was lucky enough to make it out alive, but not before having her front teeth knocked out when she was climbing a rope on the steamer whilst trying to escape. And according to Elizabeth, another man accidentally kicked her in the mouth, knocking out her front teeth and collapsing the top plate of her mouth. Now, the main reason people find this hard to believe is because according to the husband's death certificate, he actually died in 1884, which was years after the ship sank, and they never actually had any children. So many speculate Elizabeth made up this story to claim compensation or claim sympathy from the church and claim charity. But I will say this, there is no record of Elizabeth making or receiving any claim, so what her intent was still remains a mystery. But it is most likely that she did it to claim money from charities, or the story was simply created to gain sympathy. Between 1881 and 1882, Elizabeth was admitted to the infirmary due to getting bronchitis. She was also finding work in a few different workhouses, and her marriage unfortunately came to an end. And in 1884, like I said before, John Stride died of heart failure. It was only a matter of years before Elizabeth met another man named Michael Kidney in 1886, and they moved in with each other, but it was not happy families due to John beating Elizabeth on a regular basis. But eventually she turned him into the police for assault, although she did fail to press charges, and it is believed that she did stay with this man on and off for some time. She kept disappearing for months on end, and then she would occasionally return. She would occasionally go back to working as a prostitute whenever it was required, although this wasn't her main source of income. She also made money from sewing. According to Michael Kidney, she did return to him now and again. He said out of all the possible men she was staying with, she seemed to like him the most, but his statement did come from his own mouth and not Elizabeth's. Between 1887 and 1888, Elizabeth was convicted of a total of 8 times after she was arrested for being drunk and disorderly. On the 25th of September 1888, it is said that Elizabeth left Kidney for the last time and stayed at 32 Flower and Dean Street, where she had stayed on a few occasions in the past and had become quite familiar with the lady who ran the establishment, a Mrs. Tanner, and the residents of the establishment also knew her very well, and they also give her the nickname, quite affectionately, as Long Liz, which may have been given to her because she was a tall lady and she took very long strides, which was a play off her last name, or it could have been due to her facial structure. It was at 32 Flower and Dean Street that a Dr. Thomas Bernardo remembered seeing Elizabeth whilst visiting the lodging house to speak to the women who lived in such conditions with intention of setting up some kind of scheme to help children who were living in common lodging houses, and even worse on the streets. Dr. Thomas Bernardo remembers speaking in the kitchen area as many of the women stood around him giving their opinions and stating their concerns, and apparently they were all very worried about this monster who was stalking the dark streets looking for his latest victim. Thomas Bernardo later recalled that one of the women who had been drinking and was failing to hold back her tears commented on the way they lived, and here's what she had to say. "We're all up to no good, and no one cares what becomes of us. Perhaps one of us will be killed next." Very haunting words, I think you'll agree, especially since the killer's next victim was standing in that very kitchen, with all those other women who found it almost impossible to make ends meet. Elizabeth Stride herself was there listening to what Dr. Bernardo had to say. On the 29th of September, the last time Elizabeth was spent in daylight, it is known that she spent the afternoon cleaning 2 rooms at 32 Flower and Dean Street. And as the sun set, she was seen in the lodging house kitchen, and then she went out to the Queen's Head pub, but it wasn't long before she returned to the lodging house kitchen once again, before once again venturing out for the last time. All this happened between 7 and 8 p.m. Elizabeth would not return to the lodging house that night. Now, according to a few witnesses' sightings, Elizabeth was seen with a few different men leading up to her death. It was reported that around 11 p.m. Elizabeth was seen talking to a short man with a dark moustache wearing a morning suit and bowler hat. At around 11:45, Elizabeth was seen again talking to a decently dressed man wearing a peak cap, black coat and dark trousers. They were standing on the pavement opposite number 58 Burner Street. The witness was a Mr. Marshall, and he had seen the two kissing and overheard the well-dressed man say to Elizabeth,
"You would say anything but your prayers."
Which I presume is some kind of flirtatious pickup line from 1888. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's the way that phrase would have been intended. Later that night, a PC William Smith saw Elizabeth standing with a man wearing a hard felt hat standing opposite the International Working Men's Educational Club at 40 Burner Street. Later that night at around 12:45, a dock worker named James Brown saw a woman who he believed could have been Elizabeth. She was speaking with a man with her back up against the wall, once again on Burner Street. The man was of average build and wore a long black coat. The dock worker overheard Elizabeth say, "No, not tonight, some other time." At around 12:45, a gentleman named Israel Schwartz claimed he saw a woman who he thought could have been Elizabeth being attacked by a man just outside the yard where she would be murdered. The attacker had dark hair, a small brown moustache, and was approximately 5 feet 5 inches in height. He pulled Elizabeth into the street before knocking her down to the ground. The attacker then turned his attention to Israel Schwartz and shouted Lipsky, which was an offensive nickname given to Jews at those times. Schwartz wasn't sure if he was talking to him or to a second man that had appeared on the street lighting a pipe. Out of fear that the second man was an accomplice and intended to do him harm, he decided that whatever was happening between the man and the woman was none of his concern and quickly left the scene. Whether the pipe-smoking man was an accomplice or not isn't known, but he didn't give chase or follow Schwartz. If it was Elizabeth, it is entirely possible that Israel Schwartz witnessed the start of the murder and saw the true identity of the killer. At approximately 1 a.m. on Sunday the 30th of September 1888 in Duxfield's Yard, which was a passageway off Burner Street, Louis Deemshoots, the steward of the International Working Men's Educational Club, turned his horse and cart into the pitch-black passageway, and at once the horse became startled and veered to the left. Deemshoots looked down at the ground and could barely see something lying there in the shadows on the floor. In his own words, it was some kind of dark object. Deemshoots reached down from the carriage with the handle of his whip to try and push the object out of the way, but it proved too heavy, and so he jumped down and knelt by the object and struck a match, and in the briefest illumination he noticed it was the body of a woman, just before the match burned out and he was left once again in the darkness. But this time, he was very aware he was in the darkness with a dead body. He feared that it may be the body of his wife, and at once he ran into the club, praying that she was okay, and he was quite relieved to find that she was safe and sound, for outside was the body of Elizabeth Stride. At once a small group spilled out into the passageway to inspect the body. Elizabeth Stride was found. A body lay near the wall of the passage, her feet pointing out towards the street, and her throat was deeply cut. Congealed blood was smeared across one of her hands, whilst in the other she still grasped a packet of cashews. But that was all. Unlike the other victims, there was no other mutilations. Many say that Elizabeth was lucky because it is thought that the killer was possibly disturbed before he could start plunging his knife, ripping open other areas of her body, and he made his escape just as the horse and cart came around the corner. It is also entirely possible that Jack was still hiding in the shadows of the alleyway as Deemshoots struck his match, and he possibly made his escape once Deemshoots went inside to check on his wife, but it is hard to say. But what we do know is that Jack's sick urge had not been fulfilled that night. He had been disturbed just before he could fulfill his lust for blood, and he had to run away from the scene. But he didn't run far, because on that very same night, whilst the police were being called to the alleyway where Elizabeth's body lay, the killer had found another victim to butcher. And whatever unthinkable violent horror he had planned for Elizabeth, he was most definitely going to inflict the same violent horror on the next woman, only this time tenfold. The killer's next victim was Catherine Eddowes, and he took her life only 1 hour after Elizabeth's. And if indeed Elizabeth's death had been a lucky one, Catherine's most certainly was not.